September 14, 1942, Ladd Field, Alaska. The P-39 Airacobra's engine turned over on the first crank at -8 degrees Fahrenheit, and Soviet Junior Lieutenant Ivan Pstygo understood immediately that everything his instructors had taught him about American industrial weakness was a lie. Back at his home airfield near Moscow, the I-16 fighters required 2 hours of preheating in weather like this. Ground crews building fires under engine cowlings, heating oil in kettles, coaxing frozen machinery to life. This American fighter started like it was summer. The contradiction sitting on the frozen Alaskan runway was more than mechanical. It was philosophical. Pstygo was one of 1,363 Soviet pilots who would rotate through American training facilities between 1942 and 1945. Part of a pipeline so vast and so systematic that it would transform Soviet aviation from a force being decimated by the Luftwaffe into one that would dominate the skies over Berlin. The Lend-Lease Act had authorized the transfer of 14,795 aircraft to the Soviet Union, but the aircraft were merely hardware. What traveled the Alaska-Siberia route, the 6,000-mile corridor Soviet pilots would call the Alsib, was something more dangerous to Soviet ideology than any weapon. It was a different way of thinking about warfare, about training, about the relationship between man and machine. Pstygo had arrived at Great Falls, Montana 3 weeks earlier, part of a group of 42 Soviet pilots staged for the ferry route north. They expected chaos. American capitalism, Soviet political officers had explained, produced disorder, inefficiency, competition rather than cooperation. Instead, the Soviet pilots found aircraft maintenance records in perfect order, technical manuals translated into Russian, systematic training schedules posted weeks in advance. Every aircraft had a logbook documenting every flight, every repair, every component replacement. The Americans treated machines like precision instruments requiring constant documentation. Soviet maintenance doctrine was simpler. Fly until something breaks, then fix what broke. The differences extended beyond maintenance. Soviet pilot training in 1942 averaged 15 to 20 hours of flight time before combat assignment. Losses were catastrophic, but the Soviet Union had population reserves to replace casualties. American training required 200 hours minimum before operational assignment. The Americans could not afford to waste pilots the way Soviets did because Americans valued individual life differently. Soviet doctrine emphasized tight formations with no individual initiative. Pilots flew in rigid three-plane elements, following the leader's movements exactly. American doctrine emphasized fluid tactics, where individual pilots made independent decisions based on changing circumstances. When Pstygo first examined the P-39 at Great Falls, the technological gulf was immediately apparent. The Airacobra could reach 385 miles per hour. His I-16 managed 288 on a good day. The P-39 carried a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. But the most significant difference wasn't speed or firepower. It was the radio. Every American aircraft had a functioning radio. Every pilot could communicate with every other pilot and with ground control. In Soviet aviation, only flight leaders carried radios, and those radios frequently didn't work. Soviet pilots communicated through hand signals and by watching their leader's aircraft. The Americans had engineered away the need for improvisation. The differences weren't simply technological, they were systematic. On September 14th, when Pstygo climbed into the P-39 for his first training flight with American instructor Captain William Davis, the pre-flight checklist contained 67 items. Soviet pre-flight checks covered 12 items. The P-39's instrument panel displayed 8 engine gauges. The I-16 had 3. Davis insisted Pstygo verify every instrument, every control, every system before engine start. When Pstygo questioned the time this required, Davis said something Pstygo would remember for the rest of his life: "You fly the numbers, not the emotion." This single statement contradicted everything Soviet training emphasized. Soviet doctrine glorified courage, sacrifice, the triumph of will over circumstance. Heroes threw themselves at the enemy regardless of odds. Davis was teaching something different. He was teaching that aviation was engineering, that combat was mathematics, that survival and victory came from systematic thinking rather than heroic gesture. The Americans treated flying as a science with predictable outcomes based on measurable variables: airspeed, altitude, energy state, ammunition remaining, fuel quantity. Every factor could be measured, every measurement informed decisions, every decision affected survival probability. The P-39 climbed through the cold Alaskan air, and Pstygo felt the aircraft respond to inputs with precision his I-16 never possessed. The controls were smooth, the engine responded immediately to throttle changes, the aircraft flew straight without constant correction. This wasn't just a better fighter, it was a different philosophy of design. Soviet aircraft were built for mass production, for pilots with minimal training, for short service lives before combat loss or mechanical failure. American aircraft were built for reliability, for extended service, for pilots trained well enough to exploit the machine's full capability. What began as aircraft familiarization would evolve into complete tactical transformation. The P-39s and P-40s and A-20s were merely the visible component of Lend-Lease. The real American advantage, these Soviet pilots would discover over the coming months, wasn't in the aircraft themselves, but in the thinking that produced them. The systematic approach to maintenance, the mathematical approach to tactics, the engineering approach to combat. Everything the Americans did challenged Soviet assumptions about warfare, about training, about what made pilots effective. The Americans maintained aircraft the way Swiss watchmakers maintained clocks, and this obsession with prevention rather than repair contradicted every principle of Soviet efficiency. Soviet doctrine was simple. Fly the aircraft until something fails, then fix what failed. American doctrine required scheduled maintenance, whether anything was broken or not. Engine overhauls occurred every 400 hours, regardless of apparent condition. Soviet engines ran 50 to 100 hours between overhauls when parts and mechanics were available, which was rarely. The American system seemed wasteful until Soviet pilots observed the results. American aircraft didn't fail unexpectedly. Soviet aircraft did, constantly. Every component of every aircraft carried documentation. Logbooks tracked each engine's total hours, each propeller's cycles, each instrument's calibration date. Parts were standardized across the fleet. Any P-39 component fit any other P-39 without modification. Soviet aircraft required hand-fitting of parts, mechanics filing and adjusting pieces to make them work. The I-16 that Pstygo had flown in combat had instruments from 3 different aircraft, none calibrated to the same standards. His engine had been rebuilt twice using salvaged parts from 4 different engines. It ran, but not predictably. When Soviet pilot Mikhail Yakushin documented his experiences in a memoir published in 1978, he wrote, "They treated machines like precision instruments. We treated them like horses, expendable and replaceable." Ground school at Great Falls lasted 6 weeks before Soviet pilots touched American aircraft. 40 hours of instruction covered aircraft systems in detail Soviet training never approached: hydraulics, electrical systems, fuel management, engine operation. Soviet pilots learned what every gauge measured and what readings indicated problems before problems became failures. Navigation training consumed 30 hours. Most Soviet pilots had minimal navigation instruction because Soviet doctrine assumed pilots would fly over familiar territory with ground references, railways, rivers, cities. The Americans taught dead reckoning navigation using mathematics and instruments because American pilots flew over oceans and wilderness where no ground references existed. Radio procedure training required 20 hours. Soviet pilots who had never used radios in combat now learned standardized communication protocols. American radio discipline was precise. Every transmission included identification, position, altitude, intention. Soviet doctrine, where radios existed at all, used simple calls: follow me, attack, retreat. The American system allowed coordination between aircraft that couldn't see each other. Tactical flexibility impossible under Soviet methods. Emergency procedures consumed another 35 hours. The Americans had engineered solutions to every predictable failure mode and trained pilots until responses became automatic. Engine fire. 12-step checklist practiced until execution required no conscious thought. The Soviet approach to engine fires was simpler. Land quickly, anywhere. This systematic approach extended to tactics. Soviet fighter doctrine in 1942 relied on the Troika, 3 aircraft in rigid formation. The flight leader made all tactical decisions. Wingmen followed exactly, maintained position regardless of circumstances. American instructors at Ladd Field taught the Finger 4 formation, 4 aircraft with fluid spacing. Each pilot maintained situational awareness, made independent decisions, communicated constantly. The Americans called it mutual support. 2 pairs of aircraft, each pair covering the other, spacing flexible based on threat and terrain. American tactical doctrine emphasized energy management over turning dogfights. Boom and zoom attacks. Use altitude and speed advantages. Dive on enemy aircraft. Fire. Climb away. Don't turn fight where enemy maneuverability might be superior. Soviet doctrine emphasized turning combat, out-turning the enemy until gun solution presented itself. The difference was philosophical. Americans treated air combat as physics problems. Energy equations, dive angles, stall speeds, closure rates. Soviet pilots were taught courage and aggression. The Americans taught mathematics. Gunnery training revealed another systematic advantage. Soviet pilots received approximately 10 practice rounds monthly in 1942 when ammunition was available. American training provided unlimited practice ammunition. Soviet doctrine. Get close before shooting to ensure hits. American doctrine. Calculated deflection shooting at optimal range. Gun cameras filmed every training engagement. American instructors reviewed footage with pilots, analyzing why shots missed, calculating correct lead angles, teaching ammunition conservation through precision rather than getting closer. The Americans had engineered marksmanship into reproducible technique rather than leaving it to instinct. The cultural differences were as jarring as the tactical ones. American pilots addressed instructors by first names. Soviet pilots stood at attention before speaking to officers. Americans debated tactics openly, junior pilots arguing with senior pilots about optimal approaches. Soviet doctrine came from command authority and was not subject to debate. The American system assumed best ideas could come from anyone, regardless of rank. Soviet system assumed rank indicated superior knowledge. This cultural difference permeated everything: aircraft design, maintenance protocols, training methodology, combat doctrine. The Americans had engineered away hierarchy where possible, creating systems that functioned based on standardized procedure rather than command authority. By October 1942, 43 Soviet pilots had completed American training at Great Falls and Ladd Field. They would ferry P-39s, P-40s and A-20s across the Alaskan route to Siberia, 6,000 miles through some of the most dangerous flying conditions on Earth. But the aircraft were merely cargo. What these pilots carried was more dangerous to Soviet ideology than any weapon. They carried knowledge that American methods worked better than Soviet methods, that systematic thinking beat improvised heroism, that mathematical approach to combat produced superior results. This knowledge would spread through Soviet aviation like a virus, transforming tactics, training, and ultimately the outcome of the air war over Russia. The revolution would begin quietly, one squadron at a time, led by pilots who had touched American aircraft and learned American thinking. The Alaska-Siberia route stretched 2,000 miles from Great Falls, Montana to Ladd Field, Alaska, then another 4,000 miles across Siberia to the front lines. 7 intermediate airfields crossed Canada, each separated by hundreds of miles of wilderness. Weather conditions were routine -40 degrees Fahrenheit with whiteout conditions and 0 navigation aids beyond radio beacons that frequently failed. Soviet pilots, accustomed to flying over familiar territory with railways and rivers for reference, now faced flying over mountains and forests where nothing looked familiar and everything looked identical. American instructors repeated the same instruction constantly: trust your instruments, not your eyes. Soviet training emphasized visual navigation and instinct-based flying. If weather deteriorated, land and wait for improvement. American training required 50 hours of instrument flying under hood, vision blocked, relying entirely on gauges and radios. Soviet pilots received minimal instrument training because Soviet doctrine avoided bad weather rather than flying through it. The ALSIB route offered no such luxury. Weather didn't cooperate with flight schedules. Aircraft had to move regardless of conditions because aircraft sitting in Alaska didn't help soldiers dying in Stalingrad. October 1942 brought the first Soviet casualties on the ferry route. 5 aircraft lost in a single week, all from spatial disorientation. Pilots ignored instruments and followed physical sensations that lied to them. The inner ear cannot distinguish between level flight and banking turn without visual reference. Pilots feeling like they were climbing were actually diving. Pilots feeling level were actually in steep banks. American doctrine was absolute. Your eyes lie in clouds, your body lies in clouds. Instruments tell truth. Soviet pilots trained to trust instinct died when instinct contradicted instruments. November brought weather that tested everything the Soviet pilots had learned. 8 aircraft attempted the Alaska crossing. 1 American lead pilot, Captain James Stone, with 6 Soviet wingmen, including Pstygo, and 1 other American aircraft. Weather deteriorated 50 miles from Fairbanks. Visibility dropped to 0. Icing conditions formed on wings and windscreens. Soviet training said turn back. American training said continue on instruments. Stone's voice came through the radio steady and calm, repeating instructions that contradicted every physical sensation Pstygo experienced. Don't look outside. Watch your altitude indicator. Maintain 6,000 feet. Stygo's body screamed that the aircraft was diving. The altimeter showed level flight at 6,000 feet exactly. Trust your airspeed. Trim for 190 indicated. Don't chase the needle. The sensation of tumbling was overwhelming. Stygo's hands wanted to pull back on the stick to level what felt like a dive. The instruments showed perfectly level flight. Your body lies. Instruments are truth. Keep formation spacing at 100 yards. Use your radio compass bearing. Soviet pilot Viktor Belyayev would write in his memoir decades later, every instinct screamed we were diving left into the ground. The instruments said we were straight and level. Captain Stone was correct. My body was wrong. That single flight taught me more than 6 months of Soviet training. All 8 aircraft landed safely at Fairbanks 90 minutes later. Stone had navigated through 0 visibility conditions using only instruments and radio bearings. He had kept 7 other aircraft in loose formation through the same conditions using radio calls. This one flight demonstrated why American systematic training produced better results than Soviet instinct-based training. The lesson was brutal and immediate. Follow American methods and survive. Follow Soviet instinct and die. Navigation on the ALSIB route required different thinking than Soviet pilots had ever practiced. Soviet navigation followed visible landmarks. Railways ran east to west. Rivers flowed north to south. Cities appeared where maps showed cities. American navigation used mathematics. Calculate heading with wind correction. Time en route at cruise speed. Radio check at halfway point. Adjust for actual winds experienced based on position error. The Americans used E6B flight computers. Circular slide rules that calculated wind correction angles and fuel consumption. Soviet pilots had never seen navigation computers. They learned. The Fairbanks to Nome leg covered 540 miles over pure wilderness. No railways, no rivers distinct enough to identify from altitude, no cities, no visual reference of any kind except endless forest and mountains. American method required calculating precise heading, flying precise airspeed for precise time, then checking position using radio direction finder. Soviet pilot Andrei Smirnov stated in a 1987 interview, Americans navigated like surveyors with exact measurements. We navigated like hunters following signs. Their method worked better. Success rates documented the difference. First month using Soviet visual methods, 73% of pilots arrived within 10 miles of destination. After 3 months using American mathematical methods, 96% arrived within 2 miles. This precision would matter in combat. Knowing exact position meant calling accurate artillery strikes. It meant finding your own airfield when fuel ran low. It meant surviving. At every intermediate field, American mechanics performed complete inspections using checklists. Every tool had specific place in organized toolboxes. Runways were swept before every takeoff to prevent foreign object damage to engines. Americans logged every discrepancy, every repair, every part replaced. Parts were stocked at every field for common failures. Soviet pilots watched this systematic maintenance and wrote reports back to Moscow. NKVD documents declassified in 1991 show Soviet intelligence officers noting, "Americans waste time on excessive maintenance. Their obsession with documentation slows operations, but their aircraft never fail unexpectedly." The contradiction was obvious to pilots even when political officers missed it. Soviet efficiency theory said minimize maintenance time, maximize flying time. American reliability practice said invest maintenance time, prevent failures, maximize mission success. By December 1942, Soviet pilots privately admitted American methods worked better, even as official reports criticized American waste. The ferry route was killing ground and classroom combined. Every flight taught lessons Soviet training never considered. Every safe arrival proved American methods superior to Soviet ideology. January 9, 1943. Stalingrad Sector. The 16th Guards Fighter Regiment received its first P-39 Airacobras with American-trained pilots in late December. Squadron Commander Major Alexander Pokryshkin had completed American training in November 1942, returning to the front with knowledge that contradicted everything Soviet doctrine taught about air combat. The first mission would test whether American methods worked against the Luftwaffe pilots who had dominated Soviet skies for 18 months. 12 Bf-109G fighters approached at 12,000 feet, attacking Soviet ground forces pushing toward the city. Soviet response was 8 P-39s led by Pokryshkin. Traditional Soviet tactics dictated immediate engagement, tight formation, turn fighting, until one side exhausted fuel or ammunition. Pokryshkin ignored Soviet doctrine completely. He climbed to 18,000 feet, positioning his formation 6,000 feet above the German aircraft. American training called this energy advantage, potential energy convertible to speed through diving attacks. Soviet doctrine never taught energy tactics because Soviet doctrine emphasized courage over physics. Pokryshkin's voice came through the radio using American communication protocols his wingman had practiced. "I'm diving from the sun. You cover high position." Soviet radio procedure never included such detailed coordination because most Soviet pilots didn't have radios. Now every pilot in Pokryshkin's formation could communicate, coordinate, execute complex tactics impossible under previous limitations. The German formation never saw the attack coming. Pokryshkin dove from 18,000 feet. Accelerating past 400 miles per hour, fired one burst into the lead Bf-109, then climbed away using speed from the dive. He didn't turn fight. He didn't stay engaged. He executed boom and zoom exactly as American instructors taught. One pass, maximum energy advantage, immediate disengagement. The German formation broke apart trying to respond to attacks from above and behind. Pokryshkin's wingman executed coordinated passes while he climbed back to altitude. Radio calls maintained coordination. "I'm engaged. Need cover." "Braking left. Take the shot." Climbing to rejoin. The Germans expected Soviet chaos. They encountered American-style coordination. 4 German aircraft fell in 6 minutes. 0 Soviet losses. Traditional exchange ratios in early 1943 ran 1-to-1 at best. Pokryshkin's kill ratio over the next 6 months would reach 5-to-1. His memoir published in 1953 stated, "Americans taught me to think in 3 dimensions and energy states, not just turning radius." The radio advantage transformed Soviet fighter tactics more than any other single factor. Pre-American training, Only flight leaders carried radios and radio procedure was non-existent. Simple calls like "follow me" or "attack" constituted the entire tactical vocabulary. Post-American training, every pilot had functioning radio, every pilot trained in standardized communication, every pilot could coordinate with every other pilot in real time. Soviet after-action reports from March 1943 documented the change. Bandit 3 o'clock high, replace pointing and hand signals. I'm engaged, need cover, enabled mutual support impossible when pilots couldn't communicate. Braking left, take the shot, allowed coordinated attacks where one element created opportunities the other element exploited. March 1943 engagement demonstrated the transformation completely. 12 P-39s encountered 20 Bf-109s over Kursk. Previous exchange ratios suggested Soviets would lose 4 to 6 aircraft in such engagement. Pokrishkin's formation used American radio discipline and American tactical coordination. One element attacked while another covered from altitude. When Germans pursued attacking element, covering element dove on them. Radio calls maintained coordination throughout 15-minute engagement. Germans found themselves fighting coordinated opponent rather than individual heroic pilots operating independently. 8 German losses, 2 Soviet losses, 4-to-1 exchange ratio in Soviet favor. German pilot captured March 15, 1943 stated during interrogation, "The Russians fight differently now. They coordinate like Westerners. They use altitude advantage. They don't turn fight anymore. They shoot and run like Americans." American maintenance doctrine adoption created combat advantage beyond tactical coordination. Soviet pilots returning from American training insisted on American-style pre-flight checks. Soviet ground crews resisted. "We don't have time for 67-item checklists." Compromise emerged. Modified 35-item hybrid checklist incorporating American systematic approach with Soviet time constraints. Results tracked by 16th Guards Regiment January through June 1943 showed transformation. Pre-American methods produced 38% aircraft availability, with 62% of aircraft grounded for mechanical failures at any given time. Post-American methods produced 67% availability. This meant more aircraft in air, more combat power available from identical number of assigned aircraft. Battle of Kursk in July 1943 demonstrated the mathematical advantage. 16th Guards Regiment put 24 aircraft into air, 3 sorties each, generating 72 total sorties daily. Neighbouring regiment using traditional maintenance methods managed only 18 aircraft available, producing 54 sorties. 33% more combat power from same number of assigned aircraft. American lesson proved, maintenance is combat power. Time invested preventing failures produces more flying hours than time spent repairing failures. Pokrishkin began training other Soviet pilots in American methods by March 1943. Soviet command initially resisted. "Not our doctrine." Results became impossible to ignore. Pokrishkin's squadron maintained 5-to-1 kill ratio, while other squadrons averaged 1.5-to-1. By mid-1943, American tactics were officially adopted across Soviet fighter aviation. Doctrine was revised to emphasize altitude advantage, energy tactics over turn fighting, radio coordination as mandatory rather than optional, boom and zoom attacks as standard procedure. These were American doctrines taught at Ladd Field and Great Falls, now official Soviet practice. The transformation spread squadron by squadron, always led by American-trained pilots demonstrating superior results in combat. By summer 1943, the Luftwaffe faced a transformed opponent. Not just new aircraft from America, but new thinking from Alaska. German pilots who had dominated Soviet skies in 1941 and 1942 now faced opponents who fought with Western tactics combined with Eastern determination. The combination was devastating. The Americans had taught systematic thinking. The Soviets added desperate courage. Together they created a force that would push the Luftwaffe back to Berlin. The Soviet Union produced 47 fighter aces with 20 or more confirmed kills during the Great Patriotic War, all recipients of Hero of the Soviet Union medals. Of those 47, 34 flew American aircraft, P-39 Airacobras, P-40 Warhawks, or A-20 Bostons. Of those 34, 28 completed American training at Great Falls, Montana, or Ladd Field, Alaska. This meant 60% of top Soviet aces were trained by Americans using American methods. Correlation does not prove causation, but the pattern documented in Soviet military archives opened after 1991 was undeniable. The top 10 Soviet aces breakdown revealed the dominance more clearly. Ivan Kozyzdub achieved 64 kills flying Soviet-designed La-5 fighters with purely Soviet training. He was the exception. Alexander Pokrishkin scored 59 kills in P-39 Airacobras after American training. Grigory Rechkalov scored 56 kills in P-39s, American trained. Nikolai Gulayev scored 55 kills in P-39s, American trained. Kirill Yevstigniev scored 53 kills in P-39s, American trained. The pattern continued through the entire list. The P-39 dominance in ace production wasn't simply aircraft quality, it was the pilots flying them using American-learned tactics. Statistical analysis of Soviet aces revealed stark differences in effectiveness. Average kills per ace among American-trained pilots, 38.7. Average kills per ace among Soviet-trained pilots, 27.4. American-trained pilots achieved 41% higher success rates than purely Soviet-trained pilots. Soviet archives opened in 1991 contained training records confirming which pilots completed American programs and which did not. The numbers were documented and verified by Russian military historians in the decades following Soviet collapse. Training hours explained part of the difference. Pre-1943 Soviet pilot training averaged 15 to 20 flight hours before combat assignment. Losses were catastrophic, but considered acceptable because Soviet doctrine relied on numerical superiority rather than individual pilot quality. American-influenced Soviet training implemented starting 1943 required 80 to 120 flight hours minimum before combat operations. The survival impact was measurable and dramatic. Average Soviet pilot combat life in 1941 and 1942. 8 missions before death or serious injury. Average Soviet pilot combat life in 1943 and 1944. 47 missions. This wasn't just better aircraft. It was better training producing pilots who survived long enough to become experienced. Specific programs documented the American influence spreading beyond the Alaska pipeline. Soviet-American Joint Training Center, established at Kirovabad in 1943, brought American instructors directly to Soviet territory. 127 American instructors rotated through Lend-Lease programs between 1943 and 1945. They trained 2,147 Soviet pilots using American curriculum. 60 hours ground school, 30 hours instrument flying, 25 hours navigation, 40 hours gunnery, 35 hours tactical formations. This was American training methodology transplanted to Soviet soil, producing Soviet pilots who thought like American pilots while fighting for Soviet victory. Kill-to-loss ratios tracked the transformation across the entire war. Fighter aviation exchange rates documented by both German and Soviet archives showed clear progression. 1941, German advantage 10 to 1, meaning 10 Soviet aircraft lost for every German loss. 1942, German advantage 7 to 1. Early 1943, before American influence spread, 4 to 1 German advantage. Late 1943, with American aircraft and tactics spreading through Soviet aviation. 2 to 1 German advantage. 1944, 1.3 to 1. 1945, near parity at 1 to 1. This progression directly correlated with American aircraft deliveries and training influence expansion. Specific units showed the pattern more clearly than aggregate statistics. 16th Guards Regiment, heavily American trained, achieved a 5 to 1 advantage by mid-1943. 9th Guards Regiment, primarily Soviet trained, achieved a 1.8 to 1 advantage same period. Both regiments flew identical P-39 aircraft, but training produced 2.8 times better results. By 1944, Soviet command specifically requested American-trained pilots for elite guards units because results were undeniable regardless of ideological preferences. Pilot testimonies collected after the war confirmed what statistics suggested. Pokrishkin's 1953 memoir stated, "Americans taught systematic approach to air combat. They taught us to survive first, then kill. Soviet training taught the opposite priority." Rechkalov in 1967 interview, "We learned maintenance discipline kept us flying. Soviet methods kept us walking back to base." Yevstigniev in 1982 interview, "The coordination through radio communication was the greatest advantage. We could fight as a team rather than as individuals near each other." Pattern emerged across all testimonies. Pilots emphasized systematic thinking over heroic courage, energy tactics over turning dogfights, radio coordination enabling mutual support. None credited just aircraft quality. All credited training methodology transformation. Soviet state never officially acknowledged this reality during the Cold War. Official histories credited Soviet aircraft designers, Soviet courage, Soviet tactical genius. Pilots privately knew different truth. American training methods saved their lives and made them aces. The numbers told stories Soviet propaganda couldn't admit and didn't want to acknowledge. American capitalist training methods produced communist aces more effectively than communist training methods. The transformation was measurable, documented, and undeniable. Soviet pilots who touched American aircraft and learned American thinking became deadlier opponents than Soviet pilots who flew Soviet aircraft with Soviet training. The evidence existed in kill records, in survival rates, in tactical effectiveness reports, in pilot testimonies, in statistical analysis possible only after Soviet archives opened. By 1945, American influence had transformed Soviet fighter aviation completely. Tactics, training, maintenance, communication, everything had adopted American systematic approach while maintaining Soviet determination and courage. The combination was devastating to the Luftwaffe. But acknowledgement would wait decades, buried under Cold War ideology that couldn't admit American methods worked better than Soviet methods. The pilots knew. The statistics proved it. The archives documented it. But official recognition would require Soviet Union's collapse before truth could be told openly. May 1945 brought victory over Germany. And within months, the Soviet state began systematic suppression of Lend-Lease contributions to that victory. Stalin's regime could not acknowledge that American assistance had been essential because doing so undermined claims of Soviet self-sufficiency and superiority. The narrative required was simple. Soviet victory achieved through Soviet methods, Soviet courage, Soviet sacrifice. American aircraft were mentioned as minor assistance. American training was not mentioned at all. Between 1945 and 1953, Soviet pilots who had trained in Alaska were forbidden from discussing that experience publicly. Official histories minimized Lend-Lease aircraft deliveries to footnotes. The systematic training program that transformed Soviet aviation disappeared from historical record entirely. Archives containing training records, American instructor names, curriculum documents were classified and sealed. Aces who had flown P-39s and learned American tactics were instructed to emphasize Soviet aircraft and Soviet training in any public statements. Alexander Pokrishkin wrote his first memoir draft in 1948. Original manuscript contained 47 pages describing American training at Ladd Field, American tactical doctrine, American maintenance methods, American radio procedures. Soviet censors reviewed the manuscript before publication. Published version in 1953 contained 2 paragraphs about Lend-Lease aircraft and 0 mention of American training methodology. Pokrishkin's detailed descriptions of energy tactics, boom and zoom attacks, systematic maintenance, all deleted. The official version credited his success to Soviet courage, Soviet tactical innovation, superior Soviet training. Western historians knew basic Lend-Lease numbers from American records. 14,595 aircraft delivered, thousands of trucks, tons of supplies. They did not know about the training program because that information existed only in sealed Soviet archives. Soviet aviation success was attributed to improved Soviet aircraft designs. Il-2 ground attack aircraft, Yak-3 and La-5 fighters. The P-39's dominance in ace production was dismissed as a statistical anomaly with no explanation offered. American aviation historians noted the correlation but could not access documentation to prove causation. Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign beginning 1956 permitted limited acknowledgement of Lend-Lease material aid. Official statements mentioned American aircraft, tanks, trucks helped Soviet war effort. Training component remained suppressed because it suggested American methods were superior to Soviet methods, a claim ideologically unacceptable even during the thaw. Pokryshkin published an expanded memoir in 1962 with some American training details restored by censors but heavily edited. References to learning from allies replaced original descriptions of superior American systematic methods. The distinction was critical. Learning from allies suggested equal partnership. Acknowledging superior American methods suggested Soviet inferiority. Between 1967 and 1985, Brezhnev-era stagnation froze any further revelations. Aging aces began dying without having told the complete truth about their training and combat success. Western aviation historians interviewed Soviet émigré pilots who had fled to the West, collecting fragments of the story. But comprehensive documentation remained sealed in Moscow archives. The full scale of American training influence, the specific curriculum, the number of pilots trained, the correlation with combat success, all remained classified and inaccessible. December 1991 brought Soviet Union's collapse, and with it, access to previously sealed military archives. Western and Russian researchers gained access to training records, American instructor rosters, curriculum documents, Soviet after-action reports. The full documentation of American training program was revealed for the first time. Russian aviation historian Colonel General Dmitry Kazanov published findings in 1993 based on newly opened archives. Numbers were documented with precision. 363 Soviet pilots trained by Americans, 127 American instructors in the USSR, Joint Training Centers operational 1942 through 1945. Training curriculum documents showed exact replication of American methodology. Soviet tactical reports explicitly credited American methods with improved combat results. Post-Soviet Russian military response was pragmatically honest in ways Soviet regime could never permit. Official Russian military history, published 1995, stated, "We learned from allies. This strengthened us and contributed to victory. American training methods complemented Soviet courage and determination. The ideological barrier to acknowledgement had collapsed with Soviet Union itself. Modern Russia could admit what Soviet Union could not. American training had been essential to Soviet aviation success. Surviving aces finally spoke freely." Grigory Rechkalov in 1995 interview at age 77. "I can finally say the truth after 50 years. Americans taught us to be professional pilots, not just brave ones. They taught systematic thinking that saved my life repeatedly. Soviet training taught courage. American training taught survival and effectiveness. Both were necessary for victory." Russian Air Force officially acknowledged American training contributions in 2012. Monument erected at Fort Wainwright, Alaska, formerly Ladd Field, with inscription in Russian and English, in recognition of Soviet and American cooperation in the Great Patriotic War. Here, Soviet pilots learned to fly, fight, and win. The Russian text specifically mentioned training cooperation, acknowledging what Soviet regime had suppressed for 46 years. Museums in Moscow now display P-39 Airacobras with complete historical context, including Lend-Lease program and training pipeline. Educational materials used in Russian military academies acknowledge American tactical influence on Soviet aviation doctrine development. The transformation from denial to recognition took 5 decades, but modern Russian military historians and pilots openly discuss American training contributions without ideological constraint. The lessons learned in Alaska between 1942 and 1945 proved timeless. Modern Russian pilots study same energy tactics, same radio coordination, same systematic maintenance American instructors taught their predecessors. The doctrine has evolved, but fundamental principles remain. Systematic thinking produces better results than improvisation. Coordination through communication enables complex tactics. Maintenance discipline creates combat power. These were American lessons in 1942. They remain valid lessons today. The Soviet pilots who touched down in Alaska expecting American weakness discovered American strength. Not military might measured in tanks and aircraft, but systematic thinking applied to every aspect of aviation. The transformation they underwent, from ideology to pragmatism, from improvisation to method, from individual heroism to coordinated teamwork, won the air war over Russia. They became aces, not despite American training, but because of it. The evidence was always in the numbers, in the kill ratios, in the survival rates. It just took 50 years before the truth could be acknowledged openly. They learned to fly in Alaska, they fought over Russia, and they won because American methods worked.